thin line of vitrified earth runs beneath the oldest strata, a ribbon of glass where soil has been fused to stone by heat and impact, and within that ribbon small, deliberate fractures radiate like lightning scars. Where a city once rose, there are now terraces of collapsed concrete and metal, and in the shadowed hollows, archaeologists have found rib bones thickened and grafted with ceramic filaments, joints welded with primitive alloy collars, and teeth filed in patterns that suggest ritual as much as function. Runic tooling marks, now eroded beyond clean reading, still show deliberate repeated strikes where plates of armour were once shaped and fitted around a body rather than grown to it. Smells of old oil and burned organics cling to the deepest layers of those ruins. Sound tests in sealed chambers pick up ossified cavities and the faint echoes of marching. The artifacts are not trophies, they are functional wreckage, broken actuator pistons, half-melted power cells stamped with uncertain sigils, and straps and bindings adapted for bodies that will not conform to a single small human form. Buried testimonies in municipal ledgers and in the scavenged columns of ruined forts refer to a time when these things were not wreckage but instruments. Surviving accounts describe how such bodies moved through the cities and battlefields as the instruments of a single will, ruthlessly efficient, designed for violence and built not for longevity, but for immediate overwhelming effect. Only after those traces have been described, catalogued and cross-referenced do the dry chronicles give the name applied to those instruments in the oldest surviving records, the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors were the first mass-produced superhuman soldiers attributed directly to the design and will of the Emperor of Mankind, forged during the epoch historians call the Unification Wars on Terra. Their emergence represented a deliberate, pragmatic experiment in social engineering and warcraft, to reunite a fractured world by force where diplomacy had failed, to supply a hand so decisive that competing warlords and techno-barbarian rulers would see the cost of resistance and submit. The techniques used combined somatic gene sculpting, alchemical augmentation, and surgical grafting, carried out in laboratories and vaults detached from public knowledge. The result was a class of warriors that exceeded contemporary human fighters in raw physical power and resilience, but which embodied a number of compromises and trade-offs that would later prove decisive for their fate and for the course of Imperial policy. Those compromises were technical and biological. The gene arts applied to create the Thunder Warriors amplified muscle fiber density, accelerated tissue regeneration, and enhanced pain thresholds, creating bodies capable of sustained, highly destructive close combat operations. Their nervous systems were pushed toward hyper-reactivity, reflex arcs shortened, motor units multiplied, and the balance between aggression and inhibition was altered in favor of maximal offensive output. These changes delivered spectacular battlefield results at the cost of stability. Metabolic collapse, progressive neural degradation, and psychological collapse appear repeatedly in both in-universe records and in later narrative treatments. Surviving descriptions emphasize that many Thunder Warriors burned their edges quickly, effective for a decade or two, but unsuited to the psychophysiological demands of prolonged peace or governance. Contemporary accounts make clear that the engineering that produced them was iterative and rushed, effective for a singular purpose, but not refined for sustainability or for the long-term genetic maintenance methods that would later characterize the legions Astartes. The practical realities of their creation shaped recruitment and induction. Unlike the later Space Marine pattern of adolescent selection and prolonged indoctrination, the Thunder Warriors were commonly created from adult adherents who had already pledged fealty, or from fighters swept up from tribal or gang hierarchies and then subjected to augmentation. This process produced soldiers with adult life experience and existing psychological patterns which the augmentation amplified rather than replaced. The use of adult donors shortened the developmental window in which the new template could be stabilized and made the population less homogeneous than the later gene seed-based forces. The archival language preserved in municipal records and private letters suggests this was an explicit choice. The need for rapid, decisive manpower overrode the desire for controlled generational production. Physically, the Thunder Warriors are consistently described as men whose bodies exceed normal human proportions in both muscle and skeletal robustness. Contemporary battle scripts and later reconstructions imply they surpass the size and mass of the early Space Marines as depicted in later Imperial histories, though precise numeric measurements are not preserved in primary logs. Where later chapters of the Legends Astartes were based on carefully cultivated gene seed and long developmental regimens, the Thunder Warriors were a proof of concept. Heavier muscle bulk, more densely packed connective tissue, and thicker cortical bone. Artist reconstructions and battlefield relics suggest unarmoured heights, standing around 8 feet tall with bulky barrel-chested frames, with armour and field rigs that further increase their apparent bulk. Any precise figures remain interpretive, reconstructed from comparative evidence rather than documented measurement, but the qualitative consensus across sources is consistent. They were large, densely constructed, and engineered primarily for shock and attrition. This physiological profile dictated doctrine. The Thunder Warriors were deployed as instruments of decisive, high-intensity warfare tailored to the topology of pre-Imperial Terra, hive sprawls, fortified city-states, and the scattered strongholds of the techno-barbarian warlords who rose in the vacuum of the Age of Strife. Their tactics privileged close engagement, rapid penetration of defensive lines, and the use of psychological shock. Where slower or more subtle approaches might have preserved infrastructure or civilian lives, the operational guidance that survives in fragmentary campaign notes favours overwhelming force. Assaults were designed to break will as much as line, to make examples of resistance quickly and unequivocally. Their armour, weapons, and field engineering emphasised mobility within urban rubble, the capacity to move through collapsed infrastructure, and tools for breaching fortifications rather than for prolonged remote attrition. The social consequence of those choices was inevitable. Men shaped so thoroughly for war and not for civic life carry within them the structural potential for upheaval in the interregnum after victory. The historical record notes, in both public and concealed editions, that the Thunder Warriors' conditioning and design left them ill-suited for the delicate arts of governance and integration. Anecdotal accounts rescued from sealed vaults show cases of former Thunder Warriors who attempted to carve out fiefdoms in the ashes of conquered cities, or who pursued vendettas against those they perceived as betrayers. Other fragments describe those few who tried to transition into guarded roles, enforcers in the New Order, only to find their constitutions failing them as metabolic systems threaded with hastily applied gene arts collapsed under the demands of age and chronic stress. The cumulative effect was a categorical mismatch between the Emperor's tactical aim and the long-term socio-political stability he required. Organisation was formalised enough to be effective but not so codified as to anticipate the later Legiones Astartes. The Thunder regiments were arrayed in numbers that tradition records as 20 separate bodies, each tailored to particular theatres and specialties, and each led by figures elevated from within the warrior caste for exceptional combat skill and command aptitude. These leaders were not the primarchs of later Imperial legend. They were superlative human commanders promoted on the basis of merit in the crucible of battle and entrusted with large strike forces. The tactical doctrine of these formations emphasized rapid concentration of force, night strikes, and the coordinated use of engineered shock units alongside siege and breaching specialists, with logistics tailored to sustain high-tempo operations for as long as field conditions allowed. The administrative records that survive in fragmentary form show the structure was coherent enough to prosecute campaigns across continents and to achieve the political aim of unity that the Emperor sought. Materially, the Thunder Warriors carried gear that reflected their operational emphasis. Armour patterns from battlefield salvage indicate early power-assisted plates that prioritized joint articulation and impact mitigation while remaining open enough for terrestrial mobility. These suits were effective against small arms and shrapnel, but were not engineered as sealed environmental systems for void warfare. Weapons caches and fragments show a reliance on hardened melee instruments, heavy close-range projectile systems, and adaptation kits for breaching built environments. The surviving fragments of Mark I patterns speak to an experimentation with actuators and exoskeletal supports that would, in later centuries, feed design lessons into more stable and widely deployable power armors. Those artifacts therefore read as transitional technology, lethal, pragmatic, and designed by engineers who were solving immediate tactical problems rather than laying down a permanent martial orthodoxy. The psychological and ritual elements of their formation were as purposeful as the biological. Initiation into the Thunder Forces often involved formal oaths and the bearing of sigils that linked an individual to the narrative of Terra's reunification. Veteran scrawls and the etchings found inside armor plates indicate a culture that celebrated campaign memory and the centralizing charisma of their commander. At the same time, there was an absence of the deeper institutional rites of passage and education that would characterize the later Space Marine legions, a lacuna that left the post-war behavioral ecology of surviving Thunder Warriors fragile. Those who tried to find a place inside the nascent structures of Imperial governance were frequently at odds with bureaucratic institutions, and with the custodial orders that the Emperor later empowered to preserve the new polity. Taken together, the profile that emerges in the records is of a deliberately engineered, purpose-built class of warriors, optimized for short-term domination, conceived as instruments to achieve political consolidation, and created with technologies that were exemplary for their moment but ultimately provisional. Their physical imprint on battlefields and cities is clear in the archaeological record. Their political imprint endures in the decisions that followed their victories. They were effective enough to forge unity in a fragmented world, but the same design decisions that made them instrumental in conquest made them a potential threat to the stability that conquest had to establish. The consequence of that tension and the decisions made to resolve it are central to understanding why the Emperor moved from the model of the Thunder Warriors to the more controlled, gene seed-based Legions Astartes that followed. The material record of the Thunder Warriors' technology is fragmentary, but those fragments are distinct enough to outline a style that was transitional between crude techno-barbarian armaments and the later standardized panoply of the Legiones Astartes. Salvaged plates and battlefield residues show armor built for immediate survivability rather than longevity, using alloys sourced from diverse Terran manufactories and reinforced by rudimentary exoskeletal systems. These suits, often referred to retrospectively as proto-power armor, were not sealed environmental shells. Instead, they featured external cabling, bulky joint servos, and a skeletal frame designed to bear the exaggerated mass of the augmented soldier. Venting ports, oversized power couplings, and exposed actuator housings suggest the emphasis was not on elegance or self-sufficiency, but on supplying short bursts of tremendous power in the assault. Maintenance logs that survive from later custodial archives mention constant failures in fluid pressure lines and overheating cores, pointing to designs that were serviceable in campaign but not engineered for generational continuity. Weapons recovered from Unification battle sites reinforce this picture of expedience married to lethality. Many were modifications of pre-existing human weaponry, scaled up in weight and power output to match the enhanced musculature of the Thunder Warriors. Heavy bolters and projectile cannons appear in fragmentary records, but their construction predates the refinement of later Imperial munitions, with shells prone to instability and feed systems more vulnerable to jamming. In the close quarters fighting of Terra's hives, blade weapons with serrated monomolecular edges were preferred. Accounts describe men cleaved apart in a single stroke, and archaeological cuts on skeletal remains confirm the power of such instruments. In some strata, energy-based tools, likely field-adapted plasma cutters and crude beam projectors, have been recovered, though whether they were regular issue or opportunistic adaptations is uncertain. The trend is consistent. Thunder Warrior gear was designed to maximize killing efficiency in immediate battle environments, rather than durability across campaigns lasting decades. Vehicles employed by the Thunder regiments likewise reveal a practical but experimental ethos. Surviving chassis suggest a hybrid fleet, heavily armed carriers built from repurposed industrial haulers assault craft designed to traverse broken cityscapes, and siege vehicles adapted from mining engines. These were not the standardized tanks and aircraft of the Great Crusade, but improvised machines intended to deliver warriors directly into combat and then supply firepower sufficient to crack opposing redoubts. In some cases, aircraft configured for low-altitude insertions were used to drop squads into enemy bastions. Written records from rival warlords describe the terror of hearing turbines in the night, followed by the sudden impact of armoured troops within defensive walls. Many of these machines left no legacy in the later Imperial arsenal because they were fragile, fuel inefficient, and incompatible with the grand logistics of a galaxy-spanning Imperium. They were perfect, however, for the desperate wars of Terra's reunification, where mobility across fractured environments was paramount and where the psychological effect of thunderous machines rolling through shattered cities was as decisive as their actual firepower. The technological style that emerges from these sources is one of immediacy, high impact, high maintenance, and unsustainable. Each tool was oriented towards shock victory, with little consideration for the peacetime role or the demands of upkeep across generations. Engineering culture during the Unification Wars was not one of refinement, but of accelerated prototyping under the Emperor's central guidance, solving one campaign at a time rather than laying down a universal military orthodoxy. Within that technological frame, the social structure of the Thunder Warriors can be traced through campaign orders, anecdotal survivor accounts, and the few testimonies preserved from civilian witnesses. The regiments were organised along martial lines that were hierarchical but less ritualised than the later legends Astartes. Each regiment was composed of companies commanded by officers promoted through battlefield merit, men distinguished by their ferocity, tactical success, or ability to maintain cohesion under extreme conditions. Loyalty was not to abstract codes but to the Emperor directly and to their immediate commanders. This hierarchy was intensely personal, with oaths binding soldiers to leaders and leaders to their regiments. Accounts suggest that insubordination was rare not because of institutional discipline, but because of the overwhelming charisma of command and the shared recognition that failure in battle meant annihilation for all. Values within the Thundercast were pragmatic. Records hint at a martial culture that respected strength above all, where survival and victory were the only currencies of honour. Unlike the later Astartes, who were inducted into an elaborate culture of brotherhood and ritual, the Thunder Warriors were defined by immediacy and necessity. Their conditioning was designed to sharpen aggression and direct it outward, leaving little room for metaphysical or ethical debate. Veterans carried crude sigils or carved marks into their armour to commemorate campaigns, suggesting a warrior culture that prized memory of conquest rather than abstract ideals. Loyalty to the Emperor was functional rather than devotional. It was grounded in the knowledge that their existence was owed to his science and will, and that his vision was the unifying cause for which they fought. In their relation to civilians, the Thunder Warriors embodied the paradox of their design. They were celebrated as liberators in some regions, feared as tyrants in others. Civilians rarely interacted with them except in the chaos of conquest, where their overwhelming power decided the fate of cities. There is little evidence of Thunder Warriors serving as governors, administrators, or community protectors. Instead, once a territory was pacified, civilian administration was often passed to Imperial bureaucrats or proto-administratum officials, while the Thunder Warriors moved to the next battlefield. Their role was purely military, their contact with non-combatants limited to moments of domination or reprisal. Some sources hint that certain regiments absorbed civilian retainers, smiths, medics, and armourers, who travelled with them to maintain gear and supply lines. These retainers were subordinate, seen as essential but peripheral, tolerated only because they kept the warriors in fighting condition. The military role of the Thunder Warriors was absolute. They were bred, armed, and indoctrinated for battle, with no provision for other duties. Their social standing derived entirely from their capacity to kill in the Emperor's name, and their personal identity was inseparable from the campaigns in which they fought. those who attempted to step outside this role, as some later anecdotal fragments describe, found themselves at odds with the society that had no place for them beyond conquest. Their short lifespans and physiological instability compounded this reality, ensuring that even those who survived their campaigns had little time to redefine themselves as civilians. In summary, the technological and social profile of the Thunder Warriors reinforces their characterization as provisional instruments, weapons given flesh, geared for immediate campaigns with little regard for after effects. Their armor and weapons were brutal, their vehicles improvised but terrifying, their leadership personal and martial, and their civilian roles almost non-existent. They were the embodiment of an age of conquest, created to win a war that would unify Terra but not to endure within the peace that followed. The traces of leadership within the Thunder regiments are difficult to reconstruct in precise detail, for their names were systematically obscured or erased once the Emperor transitioned to the Legiones Astartes. Yet scattered references remain in archival fragments, in oral traditions that persisted in isolated Terran communities, and in suppressed testimonies that later inquisitorial analysts unearthed. They confirm that, although the Thunder Warriors as a class were designed to be instruments of conquest rather than autonomous figures of history, certain individuals stood out by virtue of their battlefield command and their capacity to coordinate violence on a scale that exceeded what even enhanced physiology could achieve. Among the most frequently cited is a commander identified only as Eric Tyrannus. Surviving records describe him as a war leader of notable presence, reputed for his control over multiple regiments during the height of the Unification Wars. Some preserved texts mark him as the master of the Thunder regiments in their entirety, or at least as the first among equals in the chain of command. His physical description is inconsistent. Some sources present him as larger even than his enhanced peers, others emphasize his tactical acumen rather than size, but his name persists across accounts, suggesting a figure whose role was too prominent to erase completely. His leadership is associated with some of the bloodiest campaigns in Old Earth's consolidation, including the breaking of the Pan-Pacific Empire's armies and the final destruction of the Pan-Pacific Palace strongholds. Later legends, particularly those transmitted through the Custodes records, hint that Tyrannus survived beyond the purge of his kin, though whether in exile, seclusion, or experimental preservation remains debated. Other names are more elusive but still appear in fragments. The Thunder Warriors were organised into roughly 20 regiments, each of which appears to have had its own distinct character and leadership cadre. These leaders were not immortalised in the way Primarchs were. They were celebrated in their time and then discarded when their purpose had ended. Reports mention captains who led urban breaching units, specialists in siege warfare, and figures whose tactical genius lay in mountain warfare or desert engagements. Their command style was highly direct, often fighting in the front line to maintain cohesion, and their authority was maintained less through formal rank than through the charisma of proven violence. The famous units within the Thundercast are recorded mostly by the enemies who faced them. The Pan-Pacific warlords described regiments with distinctive insignia, such as the Lightning Bearers, who specialised in rapid night assaults with heavy melee weapons, or the Black Helms, said to be shock troops deployed in the thickest fighting. The consistency of these names across enemy chronicles suggests that certain formations cultivated reputations strong enough to leave impressions even in hostile memory. These reputations were reinforced by the unit-level sigils carved into armour and carried as banners, which appear in archaeological recovery from ruined battlefields. Though the Imperium's later historical revisions attempted to erase these symbols, their persistence in material form offers a glimpse into the collective identity of Thunder Warrior subgroups. War machines associated with the Thunder Warriors were transitional, as noted earlier, but certain types became emblematic. Among them were siege engines adapted from industrial diggers, capable of collapsing fortress walls with massive mechanical rams, and heavy transports whose reinforced hulls carried squads into direct confrontation. Accounts from surviving civilians describe the psychological shock of these machines entering city limits, their engines screaming, their hulls marked with lightning motifs, and their cargo hatches disgorging warriors whose size and weaponry overwhelmed resistance. These war machines were not standardized or mass-produced for longevity, but in their moment they were infamous, remembered less for their engineering lineage than for their association with the collapse of old regimes. The behavioral instincts of the Thunder Warriors reflected both their design and their conditioning. They were bred for aggression, with nervous systems tuned for rapid reaction, and pain thresholds altered to permit sustained fighting even while wounded. This produced soldiers whose default state in battle was one of overwhelming offense. Observers consistently described them as relentless, pressing forward until either their enemies were annihilated or their own bodies gave out. Outside combat, their tendencies appear less stable. Anecdotal accounts speak of volatility, sudden bursts of rage, and an inability to adapt to the slower rhythms of civilian interaction. Some reports even suggest that their aggressive instincts often turned inward during periods of inactivity, manifesting in fratricidal violence or destructive behavior toward their environment. The rapid burnout of their lifespans can be partially attributed to this instability, for their bodies and minds were designed for continuous war and not for extended peace. Rituals within the Thunder regiments were pragmatic but still present. Warriors mark victories by carving campaign glyphs into their armor or etching symbols onto weapons. Some wore scars deliberately, either from self-infliction or from ritual duels intended to prove loyalty and ferocity. Testimonies from conquered populations describe battlefield displays after victory, stacking enemy weapons, daubing walls with blood, or raising banners at key sites as ways to cement the memory of conquest. These rituals were not codified in the manner of the Astartes' later traditions, but they offered cohesion within units and reinforced the shared identity of men whose lives were short and violent. Their ethics were similarly functional. Strength and loyalty were valued, weakness and betrayal were despised. There is little evidence of a moral code beyond these basics, and their actions on campaigns suggest that civilian lives were expendable when weighed against the Emperor's directive of unification. Internal divisions existed within the Thundercast, though not in the elaborate form of later Legion chapters. Evidence points to caste-like distinctions between those warriors who served as line infantry, those elevated to leadership positions, and those who specialized in particular combat roles such as siege breachers, executioners, or scouts. Rank was earned and enforced through violence and battlefield success rather than institutional bureaucracy. Warriors who faltered in battle were often discarded, either killed outright or relegated to menial roles within the marching columns. Survivors note that camaraderie was real within units, but it was fragile, always under strain from the inherent instability of their design and the pressure of endless campaigns. The image that emerges is of a caste of warriors both exalted and doomed. Famous leaders like Aric Tyrannus embodied their potential for greatness, but also highlighted the fragility of their legacy, for their names were swiftly buried when the Imperium turned to the more stable Geneseed project. Their units carried reputations that terrified enemies, but those reputations were deliberately dismantled to prevent them from eclipsing the narrative of the Astartes. Their behavioral instincts made them unmatched on the battlefield, yet left them unsuited to the very peace they had fought to create. Their rituals, ethics, and divisions gave them cohesion, in the short term, but none of it endured beyond their engineered lifespans. They were weapons made flesh, and when the need for that weapon passed, their society, leaders, and culture were allowed to fade into obscurity, remembered only in fragments, and in the scars they left on the world they helped to unify. The institutions that would later dominate the Imperium of Man, the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus, existed in fragmented or evolving forms during the era of the Unification Wars. Their impressions of the Thunder Warriors were not purely abstract judgments, but informed by pragmatic concerns, survival, utility, and the potential to align or clash with the Emperor's consolidation of Terra. In understanding these relationships, one must consider the incomplete structures of both the Administratum and Mechanicus in that era, and the unique position of the Thunder Warriors as both instruments of conquest and symbols of the Emperor's will. The Adeptus Administratum as it is known in later millennia had not yet fully crystallized. Instead, it existed as a growing bureaucratic organ within the wider Terran Empire the Emperor was building. It was a collection of proto-bureaucrats, record keepers, and governance officials drawn from defeated states, willing technocrats, and loyalist intellectuals who found safety under the advancing banner of the Emperor. From their perspective, the Thunder Warriors were both the engine of their security and the looming shadow of their own fragility. They were indispensable in winning compliance from warlords and proto-states, yet deeply problematic for the maintenance of civil stability once regions were pacified. Reports and impressions suggest that administrative officials lived in an uneasy state, simultaneously exalting the Thunder Warriors as saviors while quietly regarding them as uncontrollable and temporary. For the Proto-Administratum, the primary political dilemma centered on what role, if any, the Thunder Warriors could occupy within the machinery of governance. Their methods were too violent, their presence too destabilizing, and their personalities too far removed from the bureaucratic ideals of continuity and order. Administrators required predictability, an ability to draft laws, collect tithes, and manage resources. But wherever Thunder Warriors lingered, cities dissolved into intimidation and destruction rather than stability. Thus, while the Administratum acknowledged their utility, it quietly pressed for their gradual removal from positions of civil enforcement as soon as the opportunity presented itself. In hindsight, this aligns with the Emperor's own trajectory, as he recognized that a more enduring warrior class would be required for the governance of a galactic empire. In contrast, the Adeptus Mechanicus, or more precisely the Mechanicum of Mars, approached the Thunder Warriors from a technical and theological lens. Though formal allegiance between Terra and Mars would not be sealed until the Treaty of Olympus Mons, the Mechanicum was far from ignorant of events on Earth. Information flowed through secretive channels, and Mechanicum agents monitored the progress of the Emperor's wars with keen interest. For the Mechanicum, the Thunder Warriors were both an impressive demonstration of bioengineering prowess and a potential affront to their monopolistic views on technological authority. Here was a warrior caste that embodied principles of augmentation, genetic refinement, and war-machine synergy, domains the Mechanicum claimed as its own by divine right of the Omnissiah. The political stance of the Mechanicum in this period was cautious. The Emperor was not yet fully revealed as the Omnissiah to the Martian priesthood, but his capacity to forge armies of genetically engineered giants was undeniable evidence of knowledge bordering on divine. This caused tension within the Mechanicum. On one hand, some factions saw in the Thunder Warriors proof that the Emperor's genius was compatible with their doctrines, an omen of a possible alliance. On the other, more conservative or orthodox sects viewed them as abominations, hastily assembled constructs that violated the machine god's sacred laws of form and function. This ambivalence shaped their political maneuvering. While they did not oppose the existence of the Thunder Warriors directly, they refrained from granting them theological legitimacy. The Mechanicum would not officially anoint them as sanctified warforms. Instead, they were tolerated as crude but functional tools of conquest. The theme of conflict and cooperation between these institutions is subtle but significant. The Administratum, being concerned with social order, pressed for limits on Thunder Warrior presence in newly annexed cities, while the Mechanicum's agents were often more curious about their design, their augmentations, and the technologies embedded in their war gear. Administrators saw them as destabilizing. Mechanicum observers saw them as prototypes. Both groups, however, recognized a shared truth: the Thunder Warriors were unsustainable. Their shortened lifespans, instability, and violent instincts made them unsuitable as permanent fixtures of the Imperium. Politically, this meant that neither the Administratum nor the Mechanicum invested heavily in building long-term systems around them. Their role was understood as transitional, bridging the chaos of Terra's fragmented states to the more refined Imperial structures that would follow. Nevertheless, cooperation existed. Mechanicum forges clandestinely supplied or refurbished equipment for Thunder Warrior campaigns, particularly when Terran manufactories could not meet the demand for war machines and armaments. In these instances, barter agreements were struck, often informal and often mediated by emissaries of the Emperor rather than by the Thunder Warriors themselves. The Administratum, for its part, used the looming threat of Thunder Warrior intervention as a rhetorical and political tool. In negotiations with conquered populations, the mention of Thunder Warrior deployment was enough to compel compliance without direct violence. Thus, both the Mechanicum and Administratum employed the existence of the Thunder Warriors in their political strategies, though always with the understanding that their utility would one day expire. Conflict arose in quieter, bureaucratic forms. Administratum officials grew frustrated with the Mechanicum's reluctance to standardize records of Thunder Warrior armament. When attempting to track production, distribution, and logistical lines, administrators encountered gaps where Mechanicum forgers refused to release precise data, citing sacred schemata. This bred early bureaucratic friction, with Administratum scribes decrying Mechanicum secrecy as obstructive to civil planning. Conversely, Mechanicum observers criticized Administratum officials for their ignorance of technological nuance, accusing them of treating war constructs as mere columns in a ledger. These disagreements were not open hostilities, but rather the seeds of the larger political culture that would later define the Imperium. Administratum bureaucracy clashing with Mechanica secrecy, both under the shadow of the Emperor's authority. The politics of this triangular relationship, Emperor, Administratum and Mechanicum, dictated the trajectory of the Thunder Warriors' fate. The Emperor allowed the Administratum to view them as expendable, while encouraging the Mechanicum to view them as prototypes rather than perfected designs. In this way, both institutions were guided toward acceptance of their eventual replacement. The arrival of the Adeptus Astartes was framed not as a betrayal of the Thunder Warriors, but as a natural progression. For administrators, the Astartes would be more reliable agents of civil stability. For the Mechanicum, they would represent a more refined, stable expression of genetic and technological harmony, easier to sanctify under Martian theology. Thus, the Thunder Warriors became not only tools of conquest but also political instruments, their very flaws preparing the way for a new order. In assessing the relationship between the Thunder Warriors, Administratum and Mechanicum, one must note the absence of any genuine loyalty from either institution toward them. They were never seen as stakeholders in governance, nor as permanent allies. Rather, they were a means to an end, necessary, formidable, but destined for obsolescence. Their legacy within these political structures is defined less by their battlefield victories and more by how their existence shaped the expectations of what would come after them. They made the Administratum aware of the need for controllable martial forces. They made the Mechanicum acknowledge that bioengineered warriors could achieve what machines alone could not. In this sense, their greatest political contribution was to be transitional, forcing institutions to confront what they valued and what they rejected in the soldiers of the Imperium. The Thunder Warriors were defined not by governance, ritual, or political role, but by war itself. Their existence was synonymous with violence on a scale unprecedented in human history up to that point. Every record that survives, fragmentary, censored, or reconstructed from later archives, depicts them not as soldiers in the modern sense, but as living weapons unleashed against the fractured polities of Terra. Their legend is built upon the Unification Wars, a series of brutal campaigns spanning the 29th and 30th millennia, in which the Emperor sought to bring the shattered Earth under a single rule. In this crucible, the Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's shock weapon, and the impression they left on battlefields is inseparable from their identity. The best documented campaigns involving Thunder Warriors are centered around the most powerful of the proto-states, resisting the Emperor's unification. Among these, the wars against the Pan-Pacific tribes, the Scandic technocracies, and the fortress cities of the Indonesic bloc are especially notable. Each illustrates a distinct deployment style and demonstrates the terrifying adaptability of the Thunder Warriors. The Pan-Pacific tribes controlled a vast swath of territory, stretching across what had once been the Pacific Rim. They had endured centuries of techno-barbarian rule and fielded enormous armies of conscripts, armoured vehicles, and genetically modified warlords of their own. Here, The Thunder Warriors were used in their archetypal role, shock assault troops designed to break through entrenched lines. Contemporary reports describe entire tribal armies collapsing in a single engagement once Thunder Warriors entered the fray. These giants fought not as coordinated squads in the later Astartes sense, but as overwhelming masses of armoured warriors, breaking enemy morale through direct slaughter. Their power armour, crude yet effective, rendered conventional firearms ineffective, forcing enemy states to adopt heavier weapons that only slowed the pace of their inevitable defeat. In Northern Europe, the remnants of advanced pre-Age of Strife knowledge had coalesced into technocratic regimes. Their strength lay in fortifications, automated defence grids, and proto-mechanical constructs designed to replicate ancient standard template construct technologies. Against such defences, the Thunder Warriors' battlefield role evolved. Instead of simply breaking infantry lines, they were deployed as breaching forces, tasked with tearing apart fortifications that would have stalled conventional armies indefinitely. Surviving fragments of Administratum proto-reports note Thunder Warriors storming fortified cities in waves, their weapons tearing through walls and machines alike. Though thousands of them fell to automated defences, their attritional resilience was part of their function. They absorbed punishment no human army could, trading lives for breakthroughs at a speed the Emperor required. Among the most fearsome adversaries of the Unification Wars, the Indonesic bloc wielded biological and chemical weapons, along with horrifying genecraft war beasts. It was in these campaigns that the Thunder Warriors demonstrated not only physical strength, but also their engineered tolerance for toxins and extremes of the biosphere. Reports describe them wading through chemical barrages that dissolved human soldiers within moments, their enhanced physiology allowing them to continue fighting long after others perished. The Indonesic campaigns also demonstrate their tendency toward unchecked brutality. Entire civilian populations were eradicated in reprisals and massacres, acts tolerated as necessary at the time but later buried under official silence. The Thunder Warriors did not practice restraint. Their mandate was annihilation, and the Emperor's will was executed in its most uncompromising form. The fighting style of the Thunder Warriors can be best described as overwhelming force, applied with minimal concern for sustainability. Unlike the later Space Marines, who would operate in squads with tactical discipline, the Thunder Warriors fought as near-feral masses of destruction. Herded more than led by their commanders, they were unleashed in concentrated numbers against specific enemy strongpoints. Their function was to collapse resistance rapidly, often at the cost of significant casualties. The Emperor calculated that their shortened lifespans and instability made them expendable, and their battle doctrine reflected this truth. Unlike disciplined formations, Thunder Warriors often fought as individuals competing for dominance within the melee. Accounts describe them bellowing challenges, hacking through enemies with brute strength, and reveling in destruction. This lack of cohesion, paradoxically, made them even more terrifying to their enemies. Armies faced not only giants in armour, but unpredictable whirlwinds of violence. Thunder Warriors were most effective in melee. Their weapons included power blades, crude energy field generators, and massive war gear suited for hacking through both flesh and steel. Their physiology allowed them to overpower enemy warlords or monstrosities in direct combat. Firearms and range support existed but were secondary to their main function as close-range annihilators. Their appearance, towering, heavily armoured, roaring with inhuman voices, was as much a weapon as their arms. Civilian populations often surrendered at the mere sight of them, and entire enemy armies broke when their champions were crushed in personal combat. The Thunder Warriors' tendency to mutilate and terrorize their foes only amplified their reputation. Several specific battles stand out in fragmentary records, though details are obscured by later Imperial censorship. Perhaps the most infamous of all Thunder Warrior deployments, this climactic confrontation saw them face their own obsolescence. While the Emperor's final designs for the Space Marines came into maturity, the Thunder Warriors were gathered under the pretense of one last campaign. Accounts vary, but evidence suggests that they were deliberately exterminated by Imperial forces once their purpose had been served. Mount Ararat thus stands as both their greatest battle and their last, the field upon which they were betrayed and erased. In Mesopotamian territories, ancient fortress cities had survived the age of strife, ruled by techno-barbarian kings with remnants of old Earth's war machines. The Thunder Warriors stormed these bastions in direct assaults, fighting through massed human levies, crude automata, and radiation-poisoned defences. Their victory was absolute, but contemporary notes suggest that the civilian death toll was catastrophic, with populations reduced to rubble as much by Thunder Warrior excess as by enemy resistance. While the campaigns as a whole are well known, one engagement in particular demonstrates Thunder Warrior savagery: the assault on the warlord of Chagoras' bastion. Here, Thunder Warriors tore through armoured cavalry lines, reducing once proud tribal elites to nothing in a single day of slaughter. The sheer scale of violence cemented their reputation as living storms of destruction. What emerges from all surviving records is the picture of a force optimised not for endurance or refinement, but for rapid conquest. Their battles were won not through subtlety, but through the blunt instrument of their existence. They left behind not just victory, but devastation, territories so shattered that the administratum struggled to reconstruct stable societies upon them. This was, in a sense, part of the Emperor's calculus. A broken foe could not rise again. But it also explains why the Thunder Warriors were unsuitable for the Imperium that would follow. Their wars were too absolute, their victories too destructive to serve in an empire that required order as much as domination. Their fighting style was a reflection of their nature, short-lived, unstable, yet titanic in immediate effect. They burned bright and violently, and in doing so cleared the path for the more disciplined, more sustainable force of the Adeptus Astartes. Their wars were the foundation stones of the Imperium, but they were also their own funeral dirge. Among the most fearsome adversaries of the Unification Wars, the Indonesic bloc wielded biological and chemical weapons, along with horrifying genecraft war beasts. It was in these campaigns that the Thunder Warriors demonstrated not only physical strength, but also their engineered tolerance for toxins and extremes of the biosphere. Reports describe them wading through chemical barrages that dissolved human soldiers within moments, their enhanced physiology allowing them to continue fighting long after others perished. The Indonesic campaigns also demonstrate their tendency toward unchecked brutality. Entire civilian populations were eradicated in reprisals and massacres, acts tolerated as necessary at the time but later buried under official silence. The Thunder Warriors did not practice restraint. Their mandate was annihilation, and the Emperor's will was executed in its most uncompromising form. The fighting style of the Thunder Warriors can be best described as overwhelming force applied with minimal concern for sustainability. Unlike the later Space Marines, who would operate in squads with tactical discipline, the Thunder Warriors fought as near feral masses of destruction, herded more than led by their commanders. They were unleashed in concentrated numbers against specific enemy strongpoints. Their function was to collapse resistance rapidly, often at the cost of significant casualties. The Emperor calculated that their shortened lifespans and instability made them expendable, and their battle doctrine reflected this truth. Unlike disciplined formations, Thunder Warriors often fought as individuals competing for dominance within the melee. Accounts describe them bellowing challenges, hacking through enemies with brute strength, and reveling in destruction. This lack of cohesion, paradoxically, made them even more terrifying to their enemies. Armies faced not only giants in armour, but unpredictable whirlwinds of violence. Thunder Warriors were most effective in melee. Their weapons included power blades, crude energy field generators, and massive war gear suited for hacking through both flesh and steel. Their physiology allowed them to overpower enemy warlords or monstrosities in direct combat. Firearms and ranged support existed but were secondary to their main function as close-range annihilators. Their appearance, towering, heavily armoured, roaring with inhuman voices, was as much a weapon as their arms. Civilian populations often surrendered at the mere sight of them, and entire enemy armies broke when their champions were crushed in personal combat. The Thunder Warriors' tendency to mutilate and terrorize their foes only amplified their reputation. Several specific battles stand out in fragmentary records, though details are obscured by later Imperial censorship. Perhaps the most infamous of all Thunder Warrior deployments, this climactic confrontation saw them face their own obsolescence. While the Emperor's final designs for the Space Marines came into maturity, the Thunder Warriors were gathered under the pretense of one last campaign. Accounts vary, but evidence suggests that they were deliberately exterminated by Imperial forces once their purpose had been served. Mount Ararat thus stands as both their greatest battle and their last, the field upon which they were betrayed and erased. In Mesopotamian territories, ancient fortress cities had survived the Age of Strife, ruled by techno-barbarian kings with remnants of old Earth's war machines. The Thunder Warriors stormed these bastions in direct assaults, fighting through massed human levies, crude automata, and radiation-poisoned defences. Their victory was absolute, but contemporary notes suggest that the civilian death toll was catastrophic, with populations reduced to rubble, as much by Thunder Warrior excess as by enemy resistance. While the campaigns as a whole are well known, one engagement in particular demonstrates Thunder Warrior savagery: the assault on the warlord of Chogoris's bastion. Here, Thunder Warriors tore through armoured cavalry lines, reducing once proud tribal elites to nothing in a single day of slaughter. The sheer scale of violence cemented their reputation as living storms of destruction. What emerges from all surviving records is the picture of a force optimized not for endurance or refinement, but for rapid conquest. Their battles were won not through subtlety, but through the blunt instrument of their existence. They left behind not just victory but devastation, territories so shattered that the administratum struggled to reconstruct stable societies upon them. This was, in a sense, part of the Emperor's calculus. A broken foe could not rise again. But it also explains why the Thunder Warriors were unsuitable for the Imperium that would follow. Their wars were too absolute, their victories too destructive to serve in an empire that required order as much as domination. Their fighting style was a reflection of their nature, short-lived, unstable, yet titanic in immediate effect. They burned bright and violently, and in doing so cleared the path for the more disciplined, more sustainable force of the Adeptus Astartes. Their wars were the foundation stones of the Imperium, but they were also their own funeral dirge. The history of the Thunder Warriors does not exist as a complete sequence of campaigns, but as fragments scattered across censored Imperial reports, Mechanicum memory crypts, and oral traditions that survived in distorted form among conquered peoples. Many of the central accounts, such as the Pan-Pacific campaigns or the final confrontation at Mount Ararat, have entered common lore as the definitive markers of their existence. Yet the broader sweep of their wars covered far more than these famous battles. The Unification Wars spanned continents, shattered hundreds of warlord states, and erased countless minor rulers whose names survive only as half-decayed notes in administratum catalogues. Within those forgotten conflicts, the Thunder Warriors were the decisive instrument, and their after-effects shaped the pattern of terror long after their extinction. Among the least discussed theatres of the Unification Wars were the campaigns across the African continent. During the Age of Strife, Africa had fractured into a patchwork of warlord kingdoms and gene cults, many of which had retained fragments of biological science that they twisted into tribal warfare. The Thunder Warriors were deployed here to end resistance against Imperial unification, encountering both crude armies of spearmen and chemically altered champions bred for war. Surviving fragments suggest that the Emperor's forces faced entrenched opposition in the Congo Basin and along the Nile territories, where hydroelectric megacities had become strongholds of techno-feudal rulers. Here, the Thunder Warriors operated as exterminators rather than conquerors. Unlike the Scandic campaigns, where fortifications demanded siege tactics, African engagements often unfolded in open terrain. The Thunder Warriors became sweeping blades across the landscape, annihilating warbands in direct confrontation. Their armoured presence broke enemy morale with brutal efficiency, though reports note widespread depopulation as a side effect. Oral traditions recorded centuries later in those regions speak of metal-skinned giants who left behind scorched earth and empty cities. Another obscure campaign unfolded in the Antarctic regions. During the Age of Strife, a number of subterranean bunkers had been built beneath the polar ice, stocked with forbidden technologies and genetic stockpiles. By the time of the Unification Wars, these bunkers were occupied by technocrat warlords who refused to submit to the Emperor. Records indicate that the Thunder Warriors were deployed in small but concentrated forces to storm these facilities, fighting both environmental hazards and entrenched defenders who wielded ancient energy weapons. The polar campaigns demonstrate one of the few instances where Thunder Warriors were engaged in prolonged operations. The subterranean complexes demanded careful clearing, corridor by corridor, as defenders unleashed gene mutants and corrupted machine intelligences. The Thunder Warriors' brute strength proved decisive, tearing through bulkheads and overwhelming entrenched positions. But casualty rates were extremely high. In one engagement, entire companies were buried when defenders collapsed tunnels upon them. Administratum records later noted that the Emperor considered such losses acceptable, for the vaults themselves contained materials critical to his later genetic programs. North and South America, once unified by earlier global systems, had dissolved into irradiated wastelands and warlord states by the 29th millennium. The Thunder Warriors fought here in a series of brutal sweeps, particularly against the so-called Pan-American enclaves, city-states that had survived by scavenging nuclear technology. In these engagements, the Thunder Warriors confronted widespread use of atomic weaponry, radiation zones, and mechanized militia forces. Their resilience to radiation allowed them to wage campaigns that would have annihilated human armies. The Siege of New Quito, one of the few recorded by name, illustrates their role. Defending warlords deployed energy cannons and chemical bombardments in defense of their city, but the Thunder Warriors pressed forward regardless of casualties. By the end of the siege, the city was a crater of ash, and its population exterminated. The Administratum later noted that the victory was total, but economically barren. The city's infrastructure was destroyed beyond repair, and the surrounding lands were poisoned for centuries. Across Central Asia and the Eurasian steppes, nomadic war bands had survived the Age of Strife by reverting to mobility and mounted warfare. The Thunder Warriors fought these tribes in open battlefields where their size and brute strength collided with massed cavalry and mobile artillery. These campaigns reveal how the Thunder Warriors adapted when confronted with an enemy that refused to hold ground. Their approach became one of extermination through relentless pursuit, aided by proto-mechanized units that followed in their wake. Entire nomadic cultures were hunted down and eradicated, their legacy erased from Imperial records. The aftermath of these wars illustrates the paradox of the Thunder Warriors. Their victories created the conditions for unification, but they also left ruin that required centuries of reconstruction. The Administratum faced monumental challenges in stabilizing conquered territories, for the Thunder Warriors' methods left little intact. Cities were reduced to rubble, populations massacred, and infrastructures destroyed beyond immediate use. What followed was not smooth integration into an empire, but long periods of resettlement and reorganization under Administratum oversight. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the aftermath was equally significant. Many of the conquered territories contained caches of lost technology, often ruined or corrupted by warfare. The Mechanicum sought to preserve or extract these relics, but the Thunder Warriors' destruction often rendered such salvage incomplete. Yet without their ability to breach fortresses and purge resistance, much of that technology would have remained beyond reach. Thus, Mechanicus records portray them as a necessary but deeply flawed instrument, invaluable for opening sealed vaults, disastrous for preservation. The political consequences of the Thunder Warriors' campaigns were profound. The Administratum noted that many territories brought into Imperial compliance were so devastated that their populations could no longer resist, but this also meant they could not contribute to Imperial strength for generations. The Emperor's calculus appears to have been that speed of unification outweighed the cost of stability. Once Terra was unified, other institutions could rebuild. The Thunder Warriors were the tool of rapid conquest, not sustainable governance. This strategic logic helps explain their elimination at Mount Ararat. As long as they existed, their methods threatened to undermine the future stability of the Imperium. They were too violent, too unstable, and too destructive to coexist with the structures of governance that followed. Thus, their aftermath was not only physical ruin, but also their own obsolescence. The final aftermath of the Thunder Warriors was their deliberate erasure from Imperial history. Administratum records were scrubbed, Mechanicus archives sealed, and oral traditions suppressed. They were replaced in the public narrative by the Adeptus Astartes, who were presented as the Emperor's sole warriors of unification. Where memory survived, it was in whispers of giants who fought like storms and vanished without a trace. In truth, their imprint remained in the ruins they left across Terra, scars that endured long after their names were forgotten. The wars they fought were therefore not only battles of conquest, but also acts of disappearance. Each city destroyed, each culture eradicated, each population silenced contributed to their own silencing. The Emperor used them as weapons to erase resistance, and then erased the weapons themselves. Their aftermath was as much the void of their absence as the devastation of their presence. The records of the Inquisition that reference the Thunder Warriors are rare, fragmented, and often deliberately obscured. They appear not in official histories but in sealed transcripts, redacted communiques, and buried marginalia attached to unrelated files. To the Inquisition, the Thunder Warriors were not simply a forgotten chapter of the Emperor's wars, they were a problem of origin, intent, and secrecy. They represented an experiment that had succeeded too well, then been discarded, their destruction becoming as important as their creation. Investigators who pursued their traces noted with unease the deliberate precision with which the Administratum erased their existence. The erasure was not clumsy, it was structured, carried out with the same systematic force as the Thunder Warriors' campaigns themselves. Official records of the Unification Wars speak of Imperial victories and the brilliance of the Emperor's vision, but omit entirely the armies of gene-wrought giants who executed those conquests. To the Inquisition, such silence was more revealing than open acknowledgement. The absence itself was treated as evidence, and in their private archives the Thunder Warriors became a constant point of suspicion. The few accounts preserved by inquisitorial scholars describe them as both necessary and deeply troubling. They were recognized as prototypes, weapons forged during a time when the survival of humanity required brutality beyond measure. But the Inquisition's reflections also circle around the instability built into their design. The accelerated lifespans, the unstable genetic augmentations, the lack of restraint. These were not flaws, but deliberate choices. The Thunder Warriors were never meant to endure. They were created to fight, to kill, and then to burn out. To some inquisitors, this raised the possibility that the Emperor had ensured their destruction long before Mount Ararat. Their final battle may have been nothing more than the culmination of a design that already marked them for obsolescence. Whispers preserved in sealed testimonies suggest that the Inquisition viewed the Thunder Warriors as a mirror the Imperium could not bear to look upon. They embodied conquest without conscience, victory without sustainability. If the Imperium claimed to be a bastion of order, then the Thunder Warriors represented the truth of its foundations. Order built upon genocide, stability born from extermination. That memory had to be buried. To allow it to surface would have been to admit that the Imperium's cornerstone was not law or faith, but engineered slaughter. There are rare references to inquisitors attempting to trace surviving individuals. Rumours persisted that not all Thunder Warriors died at Mount Ararat. Some accounts describe malformed giants haunting the underlevels of Terra centuries later. Their bodies degraded by genetic instability, yet still immense and lethal. The Inquisition treated these stories with grave suspicion. Some saw them as myth, others as warnings that uncontrolled weapons of the past might resurface in the present. Sealed kill orders were drafted in the event such remnants were confirmed. None of those documents were ever meant for public release. Where the Thunder Warriors left only devastation, the Astartes were engineered to establish order as well as victory. To some within the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Xenos, this transition raised unsettling questions about how many other prototypes might have existed before stability was achieved. The Thunder Warriors were not an accident, they were a stage, and if one stage was buried, how many others might have been erased before the Imperium could present its perfected form to the galaxy? The deeper impression left upon the Inquisition was not simply that the Thunder Warriors had been violent or unstable, but that they revealed the Emperor's willingness to create weapons he had no intention of preserving. In a galaxy that came to worship him as eternal, the Thunder Warriors revealed that he had always been pragmatic, always willing to sacrifice entire generations of warriors once they had fulfilled their function. For an institution like the Inquisition, built upon suspicion and control, this precedent was alarming. If the Emperor could erase his own armies once they no longer served his design, what else might he have discarded? What other secrets might be buried under layers of silence? Thus, the Thunder Warriors became less a subject of open study than a hidden symbol. They were a reminder that even the foundations of the Imperium were built upon acts that could not withstand scrutiny. To acknowledge them was to question the narrative of divine order. To investigate them too deeply was to court censure, for no inquisitor could ignore the possibility that the very act of uncovering such truths threatened the cohesion of the Imperium itself. And so their name was spoken rarely, their history traced only in shadows, their impression upon the Inquisition that of a wound best left sealed, though it continued to ache beneath the surface. Under the preserved testimonies of scattered records, the Thunder Warriors appear not only as a weapon, but as a distortion in the Imperium's archives. Inconsistent reports follow them across the Wars of Unity, suggesting discrepancies that resist any smooth narrative. Campaign logs describe entire armies falling in hours, yet later clerks note no surviving populations at all, as though even the act of surrender carried no power to halt destruction. In several battle records, the listed numbers of enemy combatants slain surpass the original population estimates of the targeted tribes, forcing later scribes to amend totals in ways that still do not reconcile. Administratum revisions have attempted to standardize these accounts, but gaps remain where the figures grow impossible. The Mechanicum's data vaults preserve fragments that do not align with Imperial histories. Martian servitors assigned to early compliance operations reported machine spirits registering battlefield anomalies. Energy spikes of such intensity were logged in areas where the Thunder Warriors were deployed that entire local power grids collapsed for weeks, even in regions without pre-existing infrastructure. One sealed scrap code warning records that the biosigns of Thunder Warrior companies grew unstable at the height of battle, surging into readings more akin to reactor leaks than living organisms. These anomalies vanish after their campaigns ended, leaving questions about whether the data reflected battlefield interference, corrupted archives, or something inherent to their design. There are also references to engagements that no longer appear in the canonical Wars of Unity. Isolated mentions of campaigns fought in the Himalayan Arc, deep beneath strata later converted into Imperial palaces, suggest that the Thunder Warriors were tasked with purges against subterranean societies whose existence is otherwise absent from Imperial history. These notes are always buried in sealed layers of classification, as though the very fact of these campaigns could not be acknowledged. One passage describes them as fighting in silence, in absolute darkness, against enemies never defined, with no victory celebrations recorded and no survivors among the Thunder Warriors who participated. Even in battles confirmed and celebrated, anomalies persist. In the conquest of Pan Pacifica, early reports claim entire cohorts of Thunder Warriors vanished after initial deployment, their presence unrecorded in victory parades yet confirmed by casualty figures. Other documents hint at incidents where companies turned their fury not on the enemy, but upon each other, leaving fields strewn with armoured corpses bearing wounds from the very weapons they carried. Official records suppress these instances, attributing them to clerical error or unreliable testimony, but the sealed margins retain the raw reports. Among the most disturbing anomalies are sealed accounts filed under inquisitorial privilege. These describe encounters in which the Thunder Warrior's remains displayed strange regenerative states long after death. In one case, a cohort supposedly annihilated during the siege of the Pan-Andean citadels was later sighted in fragmented Vox recordings hundreds of kilometers away, weeks after their listed deaths. Whether these sightings reflected true survival, genetic redundancy in their ranks, or archival corruption is unclear. Taken together, the anomalies suggest that the Thunder Warriors were not only unstable as living weapons, but unstable within history itself. Their presence bends records, leaving traces that cannot be fully harmonized with the official narrative of the Emperor's unifying wars. In sealed reports, they are less remembered as soldiers and more as disruptions, forces that carved victory into reality, but left behind distortions where truth cannot be recovered. The sealed vaults of Terra hold innumerable documents that never reach the public eye. Among them, few are treated with such caution as those concerning the Emperor's first soldiers, the Thunder Warriors. Access is compartmentalized to such an extreme that even among the ordos of the Inquisition, full records are rarely granted to a single hand. Redactions are layered upon redactions, and in many cases what remains is little more than an entry code beside a notice of deliberate destruction. The files that do endure, however, draw a consistent picture. The Thunder Warriors were too dangerous to leave remembered and too foundational to fully forget. The oldest classified references are written in the clinical tone of early administratum clerks, men and women tasked with transforming oral accounts of the Unification Wars into orderly record. Here, the Thunder Warriors appear not as mythical figures but as logistical assets. Their numbers are listed with unusual precision, followed by notes on attrition rates so catastrophic they would cripple any conventional army. Whole cohorts are recorded as eliminated within a single campaign year. These accounts often end abruptly, replaced by annotations in a different hand instructing that the original should be sealed. The instruction is rarely justified, only ordered. The impression is of a bureaucracy recognizing that even the figures of these warriors were dangerous if widely known, for they exposed the instability of the gene-crafted legions. Later records become more guarded, written in ciphered script designed to resist transcription. One recurring entry type concerns reports of Thunder Warriors surviving long after their official extinction. The classification notes on these reports are severe, unverified anomaly, requires immediate suppression, or simply for inquisitorial eyes only. Many of these documents describe individuals encountered in the ruins of Old Knight's war zones. They are portrayed as broken figures, enormous and heavily scarred, but still carrying the destructive power for which they had been designed. A handful of accounts record them fighting Imperial forces with savage effectiveness, often requiring the deployment of massed troops or proto-astartes to bring them down. These encounters are never followed by public acknowledgement, only by instructions to terminate all witnesses and file the report under restricted seals. There are also files, though fragmentary, that suggest experimentation continued after the Thunder Warriors' supposed purging. These documents originate from facilities later absorbed by the Mechanicus and describe iterative projects in which tissue samples from deceased Thunder Warriors were used as a foundation for further bioengineering. The wording is dry, but the implications are significant. The Emperor's later creations, the Legions Astartes, stand apart as perfected tools, stable and long-lived, yet these scattered references hint at a genetic bridge between the flawed and the perfected. If true, it would mean the Thunder Warriors were not only discarded but dissected, their remains transformed into a stepping stone. These references are almost always cut short by later addenda: expunge, knowledge unsuitable for archival record. That such annotations survive at all is a quirk of misfiled copies or hidden caches uncovered during inquisitorial audits. The Inquisition's perspective, preserved in their own classified assessments, is not unified. Members of the Ordo Hereticus frequently interpret the Thunder Warriors as evidence of the Emperor's willingness to discard morality when it obstructed purpose. Their existence is used to demonstrate that heresy lies not in method but in intent, a rationale employed to justify the Inquisition's own extremes. For the Order Malleus, however, the Thunder Warriors are sometimes treated as a prelude to the dangers of tampering with the Immaterium. While the Thunder Warriors were not warp-touched, their unstable nature and brief lifespans are described in similar language to failed demon-binding rituals, excessive force without sustainable structure. To the Ordo Xenos, scattered reports of Thunder Warriors appearing centuries after their extinction raise the spectre of alien intervention. There are speculative notes that some warbands may have been captured, preserved, or altered by external species. None of these theories are substantiated, but their presence in inquisitorial files underscores the unease the Thunder Warriors provoke. Among the most tightly classified files are those concerning the final culling of the Thunder Warriors. Public legend speaks only of their passing into history, replaced by the Astartes who carried the Great Crusade across the stars. The sealed accounts, however, describe deliberate slaughter. Entire battalions of Thunder Warriors were summoned under false pretenses and eradicated by the newly created Astartes. The rationale preserved in these documents is stark. The Thunder Warriors were too unstable to serve the long campaign ahead, and their continued existence threatened the loyalty and perception of the new legions. Some files even suggest the Emperor himself sanctioned the massacre not only as necessity, but as proof of the Astartes' superiority, a first trial by fire. These revelations are never allowed to surface. They contradict the carefully maintained narrative of smooth progression from one era to the next. Behavioral anomalies noted in sealed reports complicate the official image further. While most records emphasize their uncontrollable aggression, there are rare accounts of Thunder Warriors demonstrating acts of restraint, even loyalty, beyond expectation. A fragment preserved in one file describes a unit refusing to abandon civilians during the conquest of Pan-Pacific strongholds, standing their ground despite orders to withdraw. Another account records a Thunder Warrior petitioning for the preservation of conquered tribes rather than their eradication. These moments of deviation, though scarce, contradict the portrait of them as purely destructive instruments. It is perhaps for this reason that such reports are marked for sealing. The Imperium prefers absolutes. The Thunder Warriors must be remembered, if at all, as unstable monsters, not as beings capable of choice. The files also preserve disturbing evidence of biological anomalies. Medical reports seized by inquisitorial archivists detail cases in which Thunder Warriors survived far beyond their projected lifespan. While most deteriorated rapidly, some individuals displayed an uncanny ability to endure, their bodies mutating to sustain their functions. These aberrant survivals often came at a cost, with bone structures warping, organs overgrown, and mental faculties deteriorating into instability. Yet even in these degenerate states, their combat effectiveness remained formidable. Some Inquisition observers note that such anomalies may have seeded myths of immortal giants wandering the wastelands, a folk memory that persists in certain Terran cultures even in the 41st millennium. The final impressions of the Inquisition are above all cautionary. The Thunder Warriors are treated as both a precedent and a warning. They demonstrate the heights of power achievable through bioengineering and the catastrophic costs of disregarding sustainability and control. They reveal the Emperor not as a flawless architect, but as a pragmatic figure willing to unleash weapons he knew would collapse in time. To admit this openly would erode the faith upon which the Imperium stands, and so the files remain locked away. Only in the most restricted circles are the Thunder Warriors spoken of as the Imperium's original sin, the imperfect beginning hidden beneath the polished edifice of the Great Crusade. The classified records close not with triumph, but with silence. Each file ends in abrupt truncation, final annotations, or notices of destruction. Yet their collective weight leaves a clear impression. The Thunder Warriors were necessary and they were effective, but they were also unstable, brutal, and politically untenable. They were purged because they could not be shaped into the myth the Imperium required. The Inquisition preserves this truth not for the public, but for themselves, a reminder that the foundations of power are rarely clean. Their final thoughts are recorded in phrasing stripped of sentiment. The Thunder Warriors served their purpose, and then they were erased. To recall them is to recall that the Imperium's rise was neither smooth nor pure. It was bought with flawed giants, discarded when no longer useful, and buried beneath the silence of sealed archives.